On this day, 1978, Muhammad Ali defeats Leon Spinks to regain the World Heavyweight Championship in what would be the final victory of his illustrious career.
And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Sunday morning with me here in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Today is a simultaneously uplifting and depressing historical marker of a day from the perspective of sports, and in particular of a legendary sportsman, perhaps the most legendary of all sportsmen, and that would be Muhammad Ali. On this day, 1978, the man generally regarded to be the greatest heavyweight boxer who ever lived, and really one of the most polarizing figures of the 20th, and going into more so in the 20th, but into the 21st century. He won his final, well, it was the last time he won a boxing match, a professional fight, let's put it that way. The positive being that he had his hand raised in victory one final time. He regained the World Heavyweight Boxing Championship, making him, at the time, the only three-time winner of the crown. The negative is that he fought twice more after that, and he should not have been allowed in the ring because physically, neurologically, he had already begun to show signs of significant deterioration, and it was borderline criminal that he was allowed to continue to fight. There were people that felt that he shouldn't have been allowed to fight past 1976, let alone 1978, 1980, 1981. Ali is, as many of you know, my single favorite historical figure of all time. The most fascinating, galvanizing, unpredictable personality, but somebody who, through it all, had he was guided by better angels more often than not. There were times in the 60s where he occasionally, in public, like in a congressional hearing or something of that nature, where he seemed to almost let his anger get the better of him. But more often than not, he made his peace with the various decisions that he made outside the ring, and he accepted the consequences of his actions. And his willingness to take risks and then accept the consequences of those risks defined his life. And I won't say for better or worse, it defined his life. And so he, as Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., he was Olympic champion. He won the gold medal, Rome 1960, as I recently discussed on the podcast. Pretty much just blitzed the field, overwhelmed everybody. And then, despite the fact that he had seemingly a lot of flaws, so this is where it's always interesting, and you could see this today, where even the best fighters, you will have experts in the sport point out what Canelo does wrong, well, Floyd Mayweather really couldn't hit hard, and these sorts of things. When young Cassius Clay came out of the amateurs, there was a lot of talk that, well, the kid he runs around with his hands down, he's going to get knocked unconscious one of these days, and all this sort of stuff. For all of his flaws, as a much younger fighter, he won the World Heavyweight Championship, overwhelmed a seemingly invincible Sonny Liston, the kind of George Foreman, Mike Tyson of his day. And he had a very successful run as World Heavyweight Champion. He defended his title 9 times, and there are those who will say that in those 9 title defenses, he did not even lose a single round. Not a single round, let alone close fights. He had tough fights, The Carl Mildenberger fight, which was 1966, also in September, that was not an easy fight. In fact, there's one moment in that fight where if Ali had not scored a knockdown in the particular round I'm referring to, Mildenberger would have won the round, because Mildenberger landed a body punch. And Ali took body punches better than, he took headshots a little too well, but he absorbed body punches better than almost any fighter who ever lived. George Foreman, to this day, will tell you, I landed some hooks to the body that should have ended the fight and put him in the hospital. And he's looking at me saying, George, is that the best you got? Yeah, son of a bitch, that is the best I got. But he was a dominant force from the athletic perspective in the ring. It was very difficult to square him up, to hit him. And once he started walking his opponent down, the fight was usually over as a competitive contest. So then the Vietnam War and the decisive actions he took, where he refused to be part of the propaganda machine to promote a war that he didn't believe in, knowing he was probably going to go to prison. And he stood up and said, hey, I'm okay with it. I understand what I'm doing. I'm pissing a lot of people off. He didn't say pissing a lot of people off. He said, but this is what my conscience is telling me to do. And I accept responsibility and I accept whatever the consequences are, because I feel like this is bigger than just one person. So we let the chips fall where they may. Now, he ended up not going to prison for that. He was convicted and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he didn't actually serve the appeals process, how these things work. And ultimately, even though he was thrown out of the sport, he was forced to abdicate his heavyweight titles. Eventually, the conviction was overturned when, you hate to say it and hate to be cynical, the country turned against the war. And by the time Ali's case came up, and he was making a little bit of money, but he had a lot of financial troubles at this time. Like, he would make appearances at colleges and stuff like that. But the country had turned against the war. And by the time his case came before the Supreme Court, the sense was that even though the justices, they seemed inclined to uphold the conviction, the sense was, this is not going to work. We can't really do this. We can't say that he wasn't serious. Look at the guy. He's still not fighting. His career might be over. And the sense of the Supreme Court justices was, this is not a criticism. This is the Earl Warren Court. We must be unanimous. We have to, one way or the other. And they knew that they weren't going to be unanimously upholding the conviction. So it ended up being 8-0 in his favor, with Thurgood Marshall, who I think had worked with a judge that had presided over an earlier case. It was something like that he recused himself. So it was a unanimous verdict. And that, also hate to say it this way, the Supreme Court was held in much higher esteem back then, even with the insanity with Kennedy and the Warren Commission on the Jim Garrison, the case that he brought. So his conviction was expunged, overturned, and he did not have a criminal record anymore because the conviction was vacated. He was no longer a convicted felon or whatever. So he was able to resume boxing. He was not nearly as good as he had been before the 3.5-year absence. He was still really tough. And for his long-term health, it was that toughness that was the double-edged sword. It turned out that he could hit harder than people thought, and he could take a better shot than people thought as a bigger man. And he was more willing to mix it up and brawl, because as a younger fighter, when he was in his early to mid-20s, he didn't really get hit that much. He took a couple of knockdowns early in his career, Sonny Banks in 62, and Cooper almost knocked him out of the ring at Wembley Stadium in 63. But in general, he was rarely on the end of a barrage. Rarely. It almost never happened. Maybe Doug Jones in 63, a couple of times Doug landed 2 or 3 punches in a row. But that's how rare it is to see a fight where, wow, he's really getting beat up here, even for 10 seconds. So he won a couple of fights, and then he faced Joe Frazier, who didn't exactly take over his title, but he kind of took over his title. He beat a guy that won an elimination tournament named Jimmy Ellis, and Ali and Frazier fought in what was called the fight of the century. And history tells us Joe ended up winning a very tough, it went 15 rounds, but Joe scored a knockdown to kind of seal it. And when it went to the cards, everyone knew that Joe was going to win. So Ali had now lost 2. What am I saying? That was his first loss as a professional. That is how 2 undefeated heavyweight champions could fight, and one of them being an undefeated former champion. If you know nothing of the history of the 60s, you say, well, what is that? How could Ali be an undefeated former champion? How did he lose the belt? Well, he didn't exactly lose it. It was taken away from him. So Ali continued his comeback, still really good, but not what he had been. And he lost another tough fight to Ken Norton, where Norton broke his jaw, either very early in the fight or kind of later in the fight. Nobody really knows for sure. Ali thought that the guy busted his jaw in the first round, and he went 12, and it was a very close fight, difficult to score. It was a split decision that Norton ended up winning. So Ali now had 2 losses on his record. And there was a sense that he was past his prime, which he was, but he was not past it as far as it being a potential force in the division still, even if there were other guys who now were considered, well, they're better than he is now. You know, Frazier is better than him, and the new champion, who was George Foreman, who was undefeated and just crushing everybody, he's also better than Ali now. But he was considered a top 5. It's not like, oh, he lost a fight, he sucks now. Everyone knew he just wasn't as good. But he continued on, and he famously, because I won't go into detail, but he famously, he defeated Ken Norton in the rematch in San Diego. I think that was also in September of 73. And he beat Joe Frazier in a return fight at Madison Square Garden, which is where they had fought previously in 71. He beat Joe in January of 74. Also a tough fight, but a clear points win. Most ringside observers had Ali winning anywhere from 7-5 or 9-3. Very tough to score an Ali fight, though, because his ring generalship was next level. He just looked like he knew what he was doing in there, and he would win rounds just because he looked good doing whatever he was trying to do, as opposed to necessarily landing the cleaner shots in a particular round. This is why it's really tough to score an Ali fight. The second fight with Norton that he won in September of 73, one judge had it 9-1 with 1 even for Ali. Another judge had Norton winning the fight. That is how difficult it was to score a fight, to score an Ali fight. It was almost impossible. But he defeated George Foreman in an enormous upset in 74 to regain the heavyweight championship. And then he defended the title. He fought Chuck Wepner. That was his next fight. That's the fight that inspired Sylvester Stallone to write what became Rocky. And he soldiered on. He had some easy fights, had a tough fight with Ron Lyle in 75. That was actually one of the best performances of that generation. Ali, he was almost as good in that fight as he had been in the Foreman fight, because Ron Lyle was tough son of a gun. I mean, he knocked down George Foreman 3 times and almost won that fight. Ron Lyle was fucking merciless in there. And Ali, although he was down on points, never wavered. And this is something that Mike Tyson has talked about with Ali, is that his will, and that wasn't just the will to win. It was the fact that he always thought he was going to win. He never doubted that he was going to win. Even in fights he ended up losing. But he always felt like, I'm going to beat this son. I'm going to get this guy. And Lyle was ahead on points, and Ali just basically smashed him in the 11th. It landed about 40 unanswered punches, and the ref had to stop the fight. But it was another fight, though, despite the fact that Ali was losing, when he had Ron Lyle in deep trouble, he started to wave the ref over as if to say, hey, he's had enough. He's had enough. We don't need this fight to continue any further. He waved the ref over 3 separate times before the ref finally stepped in. It showed that even in the heat of battle, he was human first. He wasn't looking, he wanted to win the fight, and by separating his opponent from his senses, he was hurting his opponent, but he didn't want to do it after a certain point. He would hold back. And when he beat Foreman in Zaire, if you watch the tape, before George goes down at the end of the 8th round, Ali is cocking his fist to throw another shot, because George, he actually could have gotten his balance back. He cocked his fist and he didn't throw the punch. And he was asked later, he said, George could have regained his footing. Why didn't you throw that punch? And Ali said, I thought the guy had had enough. I thought the guy had had enough. So he continued to defend his crown. He beat kind of second-rate fighters. You hate to say it, like Jean-Pierre Koopman. Then he had a really lousy fight against a top-level contender named Jimmy Young, who actually outpointed George Foreman. That was the end of the first iteration of George Foreman. He lost a fight. He was just killing Young. And then George just, I don't know what happened, but he kind of fell apart in the second half of the fight, and Young came back and outpointed him. the worst fight that Ali had, and this is a weird thing, he beat Ernie Shavers in 77, but I believe he took more sustained punishment in that fight than any other fight in his career. And unfortunately, he was already showing signs of neurological and mental acuity and physical deterioration by that point. And so when he prepared to fight again, he was already being told by his people, by, like, for example, his Dr. Ferdy Pacheco, he was being told, you got to walk away. Your speech is starting to slow down. You're not as dexterous as you were. Your fingers, your coordination isn't there. You shouldn't fight anymore. And nobody likes being told that they shouldn't. Look at football players right now when they're very young men. You see Tua with the Dolphins right now. He's 26, and there are people urging him to retire. He's 26, but they're not being craven. They're trying to be helpful and look out for your best interests. So Ali he wanted to keep fighting. He fought an Olympic champion like himself. That was how they sold it. But somebody who was not necessarily that great of a prospect named Leon Spinks. And Leon Spinks beat Ali from one end of the ring to the other for 15 rounds. It was a fight that Ali shouldn't have taken because physically he wasn't ready to fight, even though he trained. But it was more difficult for him to do the simple tasks of training. He still knew how to put his hands up and throw punches, but he wasn't anywhere near the same of what he had been not that long prior, his ability in the ring to dish out punches, to step away, the whole thing. So he demanded a return fight with Spinks. And on this day, now 46 years ago, September 15, 1978, Muhammad Ali fought Leon Spinks in the return match and beat him. He beat him it was a one-sided fight. Spinks was a guy who really, he was a better fighter. It's amazing to think that he underachieved when he was a world heavyweight champion, but he should have had a much better career than he did. He lost a lot of fights that he was where he should have won. And that's about the worst thing you can say about a talented fighter, that they lost a lot of seemingly winnable fights. So Ali, 46 years ago today, beat Spinks. But if you actually watch the fight, he doesn't really look good. He doesn't look right in the ring. His coordination is just not, it's not that he's stumbling, but he looks like the guy physically. But even the way that he's throwing punches, it's just like, doesn't look anything like what he had. The Ken Norton fight 2 years earlier, a lot of people felt that Norton, that was in, I think, spring of 1976. Many people felt that Norton should have won that fight. But that was at least a representative performance from the champ. And the Shavers fight, as much of a beating as Ali took in that fight, he still won that fight. And Shavers took Ken Norton's head off. Ernie Shavers was absolutely fearsome. I mean, he's one of the scariest fighters. There are those that think he was the hardest hitter in the history of boxing to this day, even more so than Deontay Wilder. That is how hard Shavers hit. And Ali stood up to that guy and beat him only a year before the second fight with Spinks. But he didn't have it anymore. And he shouldn't have been in the ring for the first Spinks fight, and he shouldn't have been in the ring for the second. But he did win very easily. Spinks just couldn't get to him. Like, he was trained enough. He didn't screw around. He didn't give away any rounds by laying on the ropes and letting Spinks kind of shoot his bolt. Because the thing with Spinks in the first fight is he never stopped punching. And it could be a real strategy for a younger fighter to try to tire out your opponent. And that was what Ali was trying to do in the first fight. But Spinks never got tired. He never stopped punching. And then people said maybe he was on drugs, and who the fuck knows. But the idea is that in general, to just give away rounds, it's not a good strategy. Because you don't ever have a guarantee that you're going to square a guy up and knock him out or stop him. So in the return fight, Ali won. And yeah, the fight's on YouTube in good quality, but it's just not an exciting fight. And even some of his lesser fights in the comeback, some of them were just bad. The Jimmy Young fight is just deadly dull. Well, Jimmy Young was not an exciting fighter. He was a counterpuncher. And Ali's instinct usually was also to be a counterpuncher. So to have two kind of counterpunch type fighters, it does not make for an exciting boxing match, an exciting night at the arena. But after Ali won, after he defeated Spinks, and made history again. Evander Holyfield ended up tying and then I believe eclipsing Ali's record as far as most times, separate times winning and or, holding a share of the heavyweight crown. Ali did retire, gave up the belts, but he just couldn't stay away. And unfortunately, there was some talk that despite all the money that he had made in the ring, I mean, he'd made more than $50 million just to that point in his career, which should have been, it should have been ended years earlier. There was an idea that Don King hadn't exactly played fair and that he may have had financial troubles. And that's why he came back again to fight Larry Holmes, who was the reigning heavyweight champ. And Ali loved Larry Holmes and Larry Holmes loved Ali. Ali was Holmes was one of Ali's chief sparring partners heading into the Foreman fight and then for a few years afterwards. Now, what Larry Holmes has said is that he felt that as early as 1976, he could have beaten Ali. But as a sparring partner, he wasn't going full out. He was, taking his time. But he said, I could see that my guy was slipping, that he wasn't the same even from 75 to 76. He just wasn't moving as well. He wasn't as effective at dodging. So by the time Ali and Larry Holmes fought, it was really bad. And there is a kind of, I don't want to say mythology, but there is an idea that, when Mike Tyson nearly took Holmes' head off in 1988, that he was doing it for Ali. Now, that may have been part of Tyson's motivation. But just as a historian, I've never sensed that Ali really had any axe to grind with Larry. And I certainly don't think that Larry had an axe to grind with Ali. And you could see in interviews whenever Larry talks about him, he always speaks in such glowing terms. You don't want to have to fight the guy, but they put him in front of you. What are you supposed to do? And I don't think that Larry even fought as hard as he could have, because he knew that Ali couldn't hurt him. He wasn't good. He was never a one-punch knockout kind of guy. He wasn't the sort of sleeper that George Foreman, Michael Moorer, where you could win 9 rounds in a row and then George lands one shot and the fight's over. Holmes knew for 100% certain that Ali was never going to be able to take him out with one shot, whether he was 28, 38. He wasn't that kind of fighter. So Ali lost to Holmes. It was disastrous. It was a fight that never should have happened because there were simple tests that Ali was taking that he really wasn't passing. Nowadays, there's no way they would have let him fight. You see fighters, I remember Joe Messi was a heavyweight who had a neurological issue. They're not going to let you fight anymore, nor should they. Hell, even Rocky V, as much as the movie is lousy, the movie puts forth the idea that Rocky Balboa has taken too many shots to the head. He can't be allowed to fight in a sanctioned boxing match anymore. It's not okay. After the disaster with Holmes, Ali fought once more. He fought Trevor Berbick in the Bahamas. I think it was it December 11th, 1981? It was somewhere in the latter portion of 1981. Now, he was not an old man. He was still in his 30s. But the clock is different for fighters, especially if they've been through the brutal battles that he had, whether in the wins or the losses. Because unfortunately, the damage done to the brain and the body, it doesn't really register differently whether the judge or the referee, raised your hand in victory or whether you lost the fight. The Berbick fight was actually somewhat competitive, but you could see he couldn't really throw the punches properly anymore. The reflexes just weren't there. And historically speaking, the importance of the last 2 fights, which is terrible, but the importance of the last 2 fights, Holmes and Berbick, those are the 2 common opponents that Ali had with Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson, 5 years later, he beat Trevor Berbick to win the heavyweight title. We've all seen that unbelievable footage of Berbick essentially getting knocked down 4 times by the same punch. And Tyson just squared him up to such an extent. So if you want to say that it was pretty impressive that Ali, who was so beyond being in the ring at the point that he fought Berbick, the fact that he almost beat Berbick, it would say that Ali had a spirit and a fighting heart that would never be topped. And that Berbick just wasn't that good. He wasn't really that good. He beat some of the big guys, some of the big names, of the era, and held his own. Larry Holmes, they didn't like each other, but he fought Holmes almost to a standstill in a title fight. But Berbick really wasn't that good. And then, as I say, Mike Tyson, Larry Holmes didn't have a shot. Now, Larry in his prime versus Tyson would have been a great fight. But the Holmes of 1988, although he was still good, Larry continued on for a number of years after that, and he had some big wins. He beat Ray Mercer in 1991, which was just a stunning upset because Ray was theoretically in his prime, And Holmes outpointed him. It was not even that difficult of a fight, if we're being honest. And then Larry challenged Holyfield for the belt in the spring of '92. He wasn't close to winning, but he took a bunch of rounds. And Evander's had nothing but good things. Larry was he was a great boxer. Even the older Larry was still, a formidable opponent. Muhammad Ali had a professional record of 55-2 when he fought Spinks for the first time, even with the losses in his comeback. 55-2. This is why with all-time great fighters, it's tricky to look at their final record, because often there are losses that wouldn't be there if somebody had kept them from fighting. Joe Louis only had 3 losses, although they said, well, Walcott beat him for sure the first time they fought. But you look at the records of a Marvin Hagler, who retired after the controversial loss to Ray Leonard. You look at the record of Lennox Lewis, who retired at the right time. He lost 2 fights, what amounted to flash knockdowns/knockouts. He did not take terrible punishment. The worst beating that Lennox ever took was the Vitaly Klitschko fight, which he won, because if the fight had continued, Klitschko might have died in the ring from that cut. My gosh, that was one of the worst cuts I've ever seen. But Ali was 55-2. The 2 losses both being very, very hard-fought, tough battles. The Frazier fight in '71, Joe won. He won that fight. The judges got it right. And then Norton in '73, where even though it was a split decision, it was a close fight, but Norton won that fight. So his final record of 56-5, still great. But there is a version of the Matrix in which Ali retired sometime after regaining the heavyweight championship from Foreman, and his final record is something like 52-2 or in that ballpark. And I hate to say it, there is a chance that he would still be with us had he retired circa 1975, 1976. But that's just conjecture. We can say that about a lot of fighters who unfortunately went on too long. It's really difficult to walk away in any sport. Phil Simms talked about it. We know the risks for playing football. If you want, you play until they tear that uniform from your back. That's a direct quote from Phil Simms. So I completely, not that I need to understand, but I understand the mindset of the elite athlete. It's not like a normal person, I don't think. But September 15, 1978, on this day, 46 years ago, the greatest, Muhammad Ali, had his hand raised in victory for the final time. This has been episode 305 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Sunday morning with me here in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or any of the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.